The military base was unusually quiet that morning, the kind of silence that carried weight. Rows of soldiers stood in perfect formation under the sharp sun, boots aligned, eyes forward, posture unbreakable. This was not a place for ego, excuses, or shortcuts. Every inch of the base operated on discipline, hierarchy, and respect, rules that were non-negotiable. That calm order shifted the moment Steven Seagal arrived. A black SUV rolled through the gates, drawing subtle glances from the soldiers. Seagal stepped out with unmistakable confidence, dressed in dark tactical-style clothing, moving as if the base were just another movie set. He was there as a special guest, invited to observe training and speak about combat experience. At least, that's what the paperwork said. Whispers moved quietly through the ranks. Everyone knew the name. Hollywood action legend. Martial arts icon. A man famous for playing untouchable characters who never lost control. But this wasn't Hollywood. From the observation platform stood a senior general, a man who had spent decades in real combat zones, places without cameras, scripts, or second takes. He watched Seagal carefully, expression unreadable. The general had seen confidence before. He had also seen arrogance disguise itself as confidence. As Steven walked past the formation, his casual attitude became noticeable. He scanned the soldiers, smirked slightly, and nodded as if approving a performance. A few officers exchanged looks. Something felt off. The general stepped forward and gave a formal briefing tone, outlining base protocol and expectations. Seagal listened, but barely. He shifted his stance, glanced around, and interrupted with a comment that sounded more amused than respectful. It wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. But it crossed a line. A subtle one. The air changed. Soldiers stiffened. Even the wind seemed to pause. The general stopped speaking mid-sentence and turned slowly toward Seagal. His eyes locked in, not angry, not emotional, just steady and cold. This was the look of someone measuring a situation, deciding how far it needed to go. Steven noticed the shift, but mistook it for curiosity. He smiled faintly, unaware of where he stood, or who he stood in front of. What Steven didn't realize was this. On this base, reputation meant nothing. Titles didn't impress. Fame didn't protect. And in just a few moments, one shocking action would make that painfully clear, an action no one present would ever forget. Steven Seagal folded his arms loosely across his chest as the general resumed speaking. His posture relaxed to the point of indifference. The general continued outlining the base's schedule, training rotations, restricted zones, safety rules, each word delivered with precision and authority. For everyone else present, this was routine. For Steven, it seemed like background noise. As the briefing went on, Steven glanced toward the soldiers again, his eyes drifting over their uniforms, their equipment, their rigid stillness. He let out a short breath that sounded almost like a laugh. It was quiet, but not quiet enough. One of the officers nearby heard it. So did a few soldiers in the front row. The general paused. Steven noticed the pause and spoke before the silence could settle. "Relax," he said casually, his tone light, almost friendly. "I've trained military units before. I know how this goes." The words landed heavier than he intended. The general turned slightly, facing Steven more directly now. "This base has procedures," he replied evenly. "Everyone follows them." Steven shrugged. "Of course. I'm just saying, sometimes experience teaches you what rules can't." A few heads shifted. No one spoke, but the tension thickened. Experience, on this base, was measured in deployments, not box office numbers. The general took a step closer. "Experience," he said calmly, "is exactly why those rules exist." Steven smiled again, this time wider. "Fair enough," he said, raising his hand slightly. "Didn't mean to step on any toes. But the damage was already done. As the group began moving toward the training area, Steven fell slightly behind, walking alongside a junior officer. He commented on the equipment, questioned certain drills, and made offhand remarks about efficiency. None of it was openly hostile, but it carried an edge. The kind that suggested superiority without saying it outright. Soldiers exchanged brief glances. Some clenched their jaws. Others stared straight ahead, determined not to react. The general watched it all. Near the obstacle course, Steven stopped abruptly and pointed toward a training setup. "You know," he said loudly enough for several people to hear, "in real combat, half of this would get you hurt. It looks good on paper, though." That was when the general raised his hand. The entire group halted instantly. Steven turned, surprised. "Something wrong?" he asked. The general walked toward him slowly, boots crunching against gravel. "You were invited here as a guest," he said. "Not an instructor." Steven's smile faded slightly. "I'm just offering perspective." "Perspective," the general replied, "is earned here." For a brief moment, it seemed like Steven might apologize, or at least step back. Instead, he chuckled softly. "No offense, General. I'm just used to being listened to." The silence that followed was absolute. No birds. No movement. Just dozens of soldiers standing still, eyes forward, aware they were witnessing something that was going very wrong. The general's expression didn't change, but something in his posture did. His shoulders squared. His presence seemed to expand, filling the space between them. "This is not a movie set," he said quietly. "And you are not in charge here." Steven straightened, his tone sharpening. "I respect the military," he said. "But respect goes both ways." The words echoed in the open air. Several soldiers tensed. One officer subtly inhaled, as if preparing for what might come next. The general leaned in just enough for Steven to hear him clearly. "Then show it." Steven hesitated. For the first time since arriving, he seemed unsure how to respond. He nodded once, stiffly. "Understood." The general turned away and signaled for the training to continue. But the moment hadn't passed. The base felt different now, charged, alert, watching. Steven remained quiet as they moved again, but his earlier confidence had shifted into something tighter, more defensive. He knew eyes were on him. He just didn't realize how close the situation was to crossing a point of no return. Because on this base, public disrespect, no matter how subtle, never went unanswered. And what was coming next would shock everyone who witnessed it. Where are you watching this from right now? Comment your city and country below and stay with us, because what happens next changes everything. The training resumed, but the atmosphere had changed completely. What had once felt like a controlled routine demonstration now carried an undercurrent of tension that everyone could sense. Soldiers moved with precision, yet their awareness was split, half on their drills, half on the silent standoff unfolding nearby. Steven Seagal stood off to the side, arms crossed again, jaw tight, eyes tracking every movement as if he were judging the entire operation. The general watched him just as closely. For several minutes, no one spoke. Boots struck the ground in perfect rhythm. Commands were sharp and immediate. The discipline of the base reasserted itself, but only on the surface. Steven broke the silence. As a squad completed a maneuver, he shook his head slowly. "That pause right there," he said aloud, his voice carrying farther than he realized. "In a real fight, that hesitation gets you killed." A few soldiers froze mid-motion, then corrected themselves instantly. The officer leading the drill stiffened, unsure whether to respond. The general did not turn around. Steven took a step forward. "I'm not trying to undermine anyone," he continued, louder now. "I'm just saying, when you've been in as many situations as I have, you see things differently." That was it. The general turned sharply, his movement sudden enough to make several soldiers flinch. He walked straight toward Steven, his pace controlled but unmistakably deliberate. Every step seemed to echo. Steven noticed too late. "You were warned," the general said, his voice low and even. There was no anger in it. That made it worse. Steven opened his mouth to respond, perhaps to explain, perhaps to joke his way out, but he never got the chance. In one swift, shocking motion, the general reached out and grabbed Steven Seagal by the hair. The world seemed to stop. A collective gasp rippled through the base. Soldiers stood frozen, eyes wide, unsure if what they were seeing was real. No one had ever witnessed anything like this, certainly not involving a famous guest. Steven's body went rigid. The general didn't yank or throw him. He didn't raise his voice. He simply held Steven in place, firm and immovable, forcing him to stand still and listen. "This," the general said quietly, "is what happens when you forget where you are." Steven's face flushed. Shock flashed across his eyes. Pure, unfiltered disbelief. This wasn't a stunt. This wasn't choreography. There were no cameras to cut away, no director to yell, "Stop." This was real. The general leaned in slightly, still holding him. "You don't get to challenge authority here," he continued. "You don't get to perform. And you don't get to disrespect the people who've earned their place." The base was silent enough to hear breathing. Steven swallowed. His hands twitched at his sides, instinct screaming to react, but his mind knew better. Any move now would make things worse. Much worse. The general released him. Steven stumbled back half a step, steadying himself. His hair was disheveled, his confidence shattered. He looked around, suddenly aware of dozens of eyes locked onto him, not with admiration, not with fear, but with judgment. No one laughed. No one spoke. The general turned to the soldiers. "Back to training," he ordered. Immediately, movement resumed. Commands rang out. Boots hit the ground. Discipline snapped back into place as if the moment had never happened. But it had. Steven stood there, alone in the middle of the base, breathing shallowly. His mind raced, replaying the moment again and again. The realization hit him hard. He had crossed a line that could not be blurred by fame or reputation. This was not Hollywood. This was not a place where confidence could mask disrespect. For the first time that day, Steven Seagal felt something unfamiliar, powerlessness. And as the general walked away without another glance, one question hung heavy in the air. What would Steven do next, after being humbled in front of an entire military base? If you were in Steven Seagal's position, how would you react after this moment? Stay calm, or walk away? Comment your answer below. The training ground moved again, but nothing felt the same. Commands echoed across the base with renewed sharpness, yet beneath the discipline was a quiet awareness shared by everyone present. A line had been crossed, and it had been corrected in the most unmistakable way possible. Soldiers followed orders flawlessly, but their focus carried a new intensity, as if the moment had reinforced why this place existed, and who truly held authority here. Steven Seagal stood off to the side, alone. No one approached him. No officer spoke. Even the soldiers nearest avoided looking in his direction. The silence around him was heavier than the public confrontation itself. A moment ago, he had been the confident guest, the celebrity presence. Now, he felt like an outsider who had misjudged the rules of a world that didn't bend. He adjusted his jacket, then his stance, trying to regain some sense of control. But his movements felt forced. Every shift of weight reminded him that the base wasn't watching him anymore. It had already passed judgment. The general stood near the command platform, arms behind his back, eyes scanning the training exercises as if nothing unusual had occurred. That, more than anything, unsettled Steven. There was no lecture, no follow-up humiliation, no public explanation. Just a return to order. And that silence spoke volumes. Steven took a slow breath and looked around. The soldiers were younger than he expected. Focused. Sharp. These weren't extras playing roles. These were men and women who lived by rules enforced through consequence, not applause. For the first time, Steven questioned his own assumptions. He had walked in believing confidence would earn him space. That experience, his experience, would command respect. But here, respect had already been claimed through years of service, sacrifice, and obedience to a chain of command he did not belong to. An officer passed by and stopped briefly, nodding once at Steven, not warmly, not coldly. Neutral. Professional. Then he continued on without a word. That small gesture hit harder than any insult could have. Steven watched the general again. The man's presence anchored the base. Soldiers responded instantly to his signals, even without spoken orders. Authority here wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was understood. Steven lowered his gaze. He replayed the moment in his mind, the grab, the words, the stillness that followed. He realized something uncomfortable. The general hadn't acted out of anger. He had acted out of necessity. To protect order. To correct behavior before it spread. That realization stripped away Steven's last defense. As training wrapped up, soldiers were dismissed in orderly lines. They moved past Steven without a glance, without acknowledgement, without resentment. That hurt more than mockery ever could. Indifference meant he no longer mattered in this space. The general finally turned and walked toward him. Steven stiffened instinctively, then relaxed himself. He didn't know what to expect, another warning, perhaps, or a formal dismissal. But the general stopped a few feet away. "This base runs on discipline," he said evenly. "Everyone is accountable, including guests." Steven nodded. "I understand." There was no sarcasm in his voice this time. No edge. The general studied him for a moment, then gave a single nod. "Good." That was it. No apology demanded. No explanation offered. The matter was closed. The general turned and walked away, leaving Steven standing there with a strange mix of emotions, embarrassment, relief, and something else he hadn't expected, clarity. Steven realized he had been given a choice. He could leave holding on to wounded pride, or he could accept the lesson and move forward with humility. The power on this base had never shifted physically. It had always belonged to discipline, structure, and respect. What had shifted was Steven's understanding of his place within it. As he prepared to leave the training ground, one thing was certain. This experience would stay with him far longer than any applause ever had. And whatever happened next would define how this moment was remembered, not just by the base, but by Steven Seagal himself. Steven Seagal walked away from the training ground at a slower pace than before. Each step felt deliberate, heavier than it should have. The confident stride he had arrived with was gone, replaced by something quieter, more careful. The sounds of the base followed him, distant commands, rhythmic footfalls, the low hum of activity that never truly stopped. Life here moved forward, indifferent to his presence. That realization lingered. He reached a shaded area near the edge of the compound and stopped. For a moment, he simply stood there, hands resting at his sides, staring at nothing in particular. His reflection stared back from a dark window, hair slightly out of place, expression unfamiliar. Not anger. Not defiance. Something closer to restraint. He exhaled slowly. For years, Steven had lived in spaces where reputation arrived before he did. People adjusted their behavior the moment they heard his name. Sets paused. Conversations softened. Authority bent. Even criticism came carefully packaged. He had grown used to it, not consciously, perhaps, but deeply enough that it shaped how he moved through the world. The base had stripped that away in seconds. There were no cameras asking for reactions. No fans waiting for autographs. No assistants smoothing over missteps. Just consequences, clear, immediate, and unapologetic. Stephen replayed the moment again, the general's grip, the stillness, the words spoken without raised volume. It hadn't been about humiliation. That was what surprised him most. The general hadn't tried to make an example out of him for spectacle's sake. The action had been surgical, precise, intentional, and final. It was discipline in its purest form. Stephen ran a hand through his hair, then stopped himself, almost amused by the irony. He felt the urge to justify himself, to argue that he hadn't meant disrespect, that his intentions were misunderstood. But the words felt hollow before they even formed. Intent didn't matter here. Impact did. He realized something else, too. No one had tried to embarrass him afterward. No whispers. No side comments. The base had corrected the problem and moved on. That efficiency was humbling in its own way. There was no room for ego when the mission came first. A junior officer approached, holding a clipboard. Stephen straightened instinctively, then caught himself. The officer stopped at a respectful distance. "Transportation will be ready shortly," the officer said calmly. Stephen nodded. "Thank you." The officer hesitated, then added, "For what it's worth, this place doesn't react unless it has to." Stephen met his eyes and gave a short nod. "I understand that now." The officer left without another word. Left alone again, Stephen thought about the line the general had drawn, clear and immovable. He understood now that the base wasn't hostile to him. It was neutral. He had forced it to respond. That distinction mattered. When the general's words echoed again, "This is not a movie set," Stephen felt the weight behind them. He had built a career portraying control, dominance, certainty. But those were performances. Here, control was earned through responsibility. Dominance came from restraint. Certainty was rooted in structure. Stephen had mistaken confidence for authority. The realization didn't feel good, but it felt honest. As he prepared to leave, he looked back once more at the training ground. Soldiers moved in sync, following commands without hesitation. There was no chaos, no competition for attention. Everyone knew their role, and respected it. Stephen understood now why his behavior had stood out so sharply. Not because it was loud, but because it disrupted something carefully maintained. He adjusted his jacket again, this time not to project confidence, but to compose himself. Whatever pride had been bruised, it was no longer the most important thing. He had been given a lesson many never received, one delivered without cruelty, but without compromise. As the vehicle arrived, Stephen paused before getting in. He knew this moment would follow him. Not as a scandal, not as a story to deny or dramatize, but as a reminder. Fame had limits. Ego had consequences. And respect, real respect, was never automatic. For the first time that day, Steven Seagal didn't feel the need to say anything at all. And that silence marked the beginning of something he hadn't expected, understanding. By late afternoon, the base had returned to its normal rhythm, but the memory of what had happened lingered like a quiet echo. Training cycles continued. Briefings resumed. Vehicles moved in and out with mechanical precision. On the surface, everything looked the same. Yet among the soldiers and officers, there was an unspoken understanding that something rare had occurred. Not because of who Steven Seagal was, but because of what the base had reaffirmed. Word spread quickly, though not loudly. There were no exaggerated retellings, no jokes passed around. Instead, the incident traveled in short, factual sentences, shared between squads, between ranks, between people who understood the weight of discipline. The general had corrected a breach. Order had been restored. That was all that mattered. And that, in itself, was the lesson. Some soldiers who had witnessed the moment replayed it quietly in their minds. Not the grab, but the stillness afterward. The way authority had been asserted without shouting. The way consequences had arrived without spectacle. For many of them, it reinforced why the chain of command existed in the first place. A senior officer addressed a small group later that day, not mentioning names, not recounting events directly. "Respect," he said simply, "is not situational. It doesn't adjust for status." Everyone knew what he meant. Meanwhile, Steven's departure from the base went unnoticed. No crowd formed. No one watched him leave. The vehicle passed through the gate, and the guards returned to their positions as if nothing significant had occurred. But outside the base, the story didn't stay contained. A civilian contractor who had been present mentioned the incident to a colleague. A brief description turned into a conversation. By evening, fragments of the story had begun circulating, carefully at first, stripped of exaggeration, focused on the shock of seeing a celebrity confronted by real authority. By the next morning, the internet had done what it always did. Online discussions began appearing. Not headlines, yet, but threads. Comments. Debates. People argued about boundaries, about respect, about whether the general's action was justified. Some defended Steven. Others praised the general. Many focused on the contrast between Hollywood confidence and military reality. What stood out, though, was the tone. This wasn't mockery. It wasn't celebration. It was reflection. Steven Seagal, for his part, did not respond publicly. No statement. No clarification. No attempt to reframe the narrative. That silence spoke volumes. For someone accustomed to controlling perception, choosing not to react suggested something deeper than damage control. Back on the base, the general remained unchanged. He didn't reference the incident in meetings. He didn't justify himself. He didn't seek validation. To him, it had been a correction, necessary, precise, and complete. A young soldier later asked an instructor about it, carefully choosing his words. "Sir, was that really needed?" The instructor considered the question before answering. "Discipline isn't about comfort," he said. "It's about clarity." That answer spread faster than the story itself. The base moved on, stronger for it. The soldiers trained with renewed focus, reminded that authority here was not symbolic. It was functional, protective, absolute when required. And somewhere beyond the gates, Steven Seagal carried the weight of an experience he hadn't anticipated, one that didn't end with applause, but with perspective. The incident didn't redefine the base. It refined it. And for those who understood what they had witnessed, the lesson was clear. In places built on discipline, respect is not optional, and no reputation is above correction. Do you think the general was right to act the way he did, or should he have handled it differently? Share your honest opinion in the comments below. In the days that followed, the incident took on a life of its own. What began as a quiet correction on a military base slowly transformed into a story people couldn't stop talking about, not because of shock alone, but because of what it represented. The details varied depending on who told it, but the core never changed, a moment where fame met real authority, and authority didn't blink. Online discussions grew louder. Some framed it as a clash of worlds, Hollywood versus the military. Others saw it as a reminder that certain environments operate on rules far older and stronger than celebrity culture. Comment sections filled with debates about respect, discipline, and whether anyone, no matter how famous, should ever be exempt from consequences. What made the story powerful wasn't aggression. It was restraint. The general never spoke publicly. No interviews. No explanations. That silence reinforced the message more than any statement could have. On the base, nothing changed. Training continued. Missions were planned. Discipline remained intact. The incident wasn't treated as an event. It was treated as a correction already resolved. Steven Seagal also stayed silent. For many observers, that silence was unexpected. In a world where narratives are often rushed to be controlled, his lack of response suggested reflection rather than resistance. People speculated endlessly, some claiming regret, others suggesting respect had finally been earned. But the truth didn't need clarification. The lesson was already clear. This wasn't a story about humiliation. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about boundaries, and what happens when they're crossed in places that don't tolerate confusion between confidence and authority. Over time, the story settled into something more meaningful than controversy. Veterans shared it as an example of why discipline matters. Leaders referenced it quietly when explaining command presence. Even civilians began discussing how respect operates differently depending on the environment, and why understanding that difference can prevent costly mistakes. The base itself never claimed ownership of the moment. It didn't need to. Its values had spoken for themselves. And Steven Seagal, whether he intended it or not, became part of a narrative larger than his career, a reminder that no matter how powerful someone appears, there are spaces in the world where power must be earned anew. In those spaces, titles fade, reputations reset, and only behavior matters. The story didn't end with outrage or applause. It ended with understanding. Understanding that discipline isn't cruelty. Understanding that authority doesn't need to announce itself. Understanding that respect, once lost, can only be rebuilt through humility. For those who heard the story and truly understood it, one message stood above the rest. There are places where ego has no shelter, and those places exist to protect something far greater than pride. If you believe that real respect comes from discipline, humility, and knowing your limits, hit like, type respect in the comments, and subscribe for more powerful, story-driven moments that leave a lasting impact.